In the smoke-filled streets of early 20th century New York, power was not claimed with noise, but built in silence, calculation, and timing. While rival gangs fought in alleys and back rooms, one man studied the patterns, measured the risks, and designed a system that could outlast every gunfight and every betrayal. From crowded tenements to hidden meeting rooms, from bootlegging routes to courtroom trials, his rise followed no accident and no impulse. Every alliance, every move, every betrayal served a larger structure. This is the story of how crime became organized, how chaos became controlled, and how one strategist reshaped an entire underworld. In the dark, smoke-filled streets of early 20th century New York, a city teeming with immigrants, poverty, and corruption, a man would emerge from the shadows, rising above his circumstances with a relentless drive. His name was Salvatore Lucky Luciano, and the world he would help shape was one where fear and loyalty intertwined in a deadly dance, where power was not just taken, it was engineered. The story of Lucky Luciano is more than just that of a mafia boss. It is a story of the making of the modern criminal empire, a man who understood that crime was not just about violence, it was about organization, control, and vision. At the time of Luciano's rise, the mafia was fragmented, an assortment of competing crime families in disarray, each with its own interests and turf. The old ways of the Italian criminal syndicates were marked by chaos, infighting, and a lack of coordination. But Luciano would see through the anarchy, recognizing that in order to truly wield power, the system had to be redesigned. It was no longer enough to rely solely on brute force. The mafia needed structure, a business-minded approach, and an intricate network that could generate vast wealth while staying under the radar of law enforcement. In this world, where the threat of betrayal was ever-present and loyalties could change on a dime, Luciano would build an empire not based on fear alone, but on calculated alliances and a strategic sense of timing. His rise was not marked by a series of wild, unplanned events. It was a steady climb, each move deliberate, each partnership forged with purpose. For those who knew him, Luciano was not just the man they feared, he was the one they respected, a figure whose quiet authority was more dangerous than the loudest threats. The story of Luciano's ascent begins in the bowels of New York City's Lower East Side, a neighborhood that would come to symbolize the immigrant experience in America. Born in 1897 in the small village of Lercarafridi in Sicily, Luciano's family moved to the United States when he was just a young boy. The promise of a better life quickly gave way to the harsh realities of urban poverty. The streets of the Lower East Side were tough, a battleground where survival often meant aligning oneself with the criminal elements of the city. It was here, amid the poverty and the violent undercurrents of immigrant life, that Luciano first learned what it meant to be ruthless and cunning. In the beginning, Luciano was far from the figure we recognize today. He was a scrappy, determined young man, eager to rise above his station. It wasn't long before he crossed paths with others who would play pivotal roles in his life, such as Meyer Lansky, who would become one of his closest allies. While Luciano was charismatic and bold, Lansky brought a strategic mind that would complement Luciano's vision perfectly. Together, they would form one of the most powerful alliances in the history of organized crime. But their partnership wasn't born of trust alone. It was a calculated necessity in a world where betrayal was always a step away. Lucky Luciano's early ventures into the world of crime were not exceptional. Like many other young men in his position, he became involved in petty street-level crimes, extortion, robbery, and the occasional run-in with the law. But what set Luciano apart was his ability to think beyond the immediate. He quickly realized that in order to rise in the criminal world, one had to play by different rules. Violence alone would not be enough. To be truly successful, he would need to unite the various factions of the mafia under a single banner, an idea that was unheard of at the time. At the heart of Luciano's genius was his understanding of how power operated within the mafia. The older generation of mafia bosses, men like Giuseppe Morello and Joe, the boss Masuria, ruled through intimidation and old-school methods. They didn't understand the need for unity or business-like organization. To them, the mafia was about family and loyalty, but it was also about the preservation of personal power, often at the cost of progress. Luciano saw this as a weakness. He recognized that the fractured nature of the mafia was a significant barrier to its full potential. In his eyes, a unified syndicate could dominate the criminal world, turning it into a profitable, smooth-running machine. Luciano's vision wasn't just about personal ambition. It was about creating a criminal network that was efficient, adaptable, and most importantly, profitable. He sought to redefine the mafia, transforming it from a loose collection of gangs into a cohesive organization. This would require strategic thinking and the ability to consolidate power through alliances, not through brute force. Lucky Luciano was not just a fighter, he was a planner and architect of his own future. His mind was always calculating, always thinking several steps ahead of his rivals. By the early 1920s, Luciano had begun to challenge the established order of the Mafia. His ambitions clashed with those of Mafia, one of the most powerful crime bosses of the time. Mafia, who ruled with an iron fist, was an old-fashioned mobster who believed in using violence as the primary tool of control. Luciano, on the other hand, understood that power came from something deeper: strategy, foresight, and the ability to inspire loyalty not through fear but through mutual benefit. Luciano's approach was much more subtle. It was about creating a network that could operate smoothly, making money through controlled vice, prostitution, gambling, and bootlegging, without attracting the full attention of the authorities. The infighting among Mafia families was inevitable. For years, the conflict between Mafia and his rivals would escalate, culminating in what would later be known as the Castellamarese War. This brutal conflict between Mafia and another rising boss, Salvatore Maranzano, would come to symbolize the growing tension within the Mafia. Luciano found himself caught in the middle, navigating a complex web of allegiances and rivalries. But his calculated decisions during this time would prove crucial. Luciano aligned himself with Maranzano, ultimately betraying Mafia and orchestrating his murder in 1931. It was this act that would mark Luciano's emergence as the most powerful figure in organized crime. Murder, betrayal, and power struggles would continue to define Luciano's world. But unlike the chaotic, brutal past of the Mafia, Luciano was determined to bring a sense of order to the organization. The bloodshed of the Castellamarese War was not just a necessary evil in his eyes, it was the price to pay for a greater vision. After the war, he did not simply seize power for himself. He reorganized the entire structure of the Mafia, creating what would become known as the Commission, a governing body of the Mafia's most powerful families. This was Luciano's real genius. His ability to create a system that was sustainable, something that would endure long after his death. The man who had started as a street-level gangster had now redefined the entire underworld. But as Luciano's power grew, so did the risks. His new empire made him a target for law enforcement, rival mobsters, and politicians who felt threatened by his success. The man who had once lived in the shadows would soon find that the brighter the spotlight, the greater the danger. But Luciano was no ordinary criminal. He was a mastermind, a man who understood that in the world of organized crime, survival required not just strength but adaptability. And even when the odds seemed stacked against him, Luciano's vision for the Mafia would continue to shape the future of organized crime in ways that would leave an indelible mark on history. Before the rise of Lucky Luciano, the Mafia in America was a disorganized and fragmented entity. It was a world defined by chaos, where different factions fought amongst themselves for control, often creating more enemies than allies. The underworld was a realm where brute force and bloodshed were common currency, and loyalty was as fragile as it was valuable. This was a world where power was not consolidated, it was merely fought over in the streets, in dark alleys, and behind closed doors. It was a world ripe for change, and Luciano, with his vision and intellect, would become the architect of that change. But before he could make his mark, he had to contend with a fractured criminal system that could barely hold itself together. At the heart of this fractured landscape were the two dominant forces in the New York Mafia, the Morello family and the Genovese family, both of whom had significant influence, but were in constant tension with each other. These early Mafia families were more focused on preserving their own power than on unifying their resources or strategies. There was little coordination or structure. Instead, the Mafia operated as a loose network of competing groups, each with its own ambitions and methods, often leading to violent confrontations. In the early 1900s, the Italian-American Mafia was dominated by old-world figures who adhered to traditions that came directly from Sicily. These were men who ruled through intimidation, personal vendettas, and old-fashioned methods of control. Loyalty to the family was the highest value, and power was maintained by sheer force of will. There were no overarching strategies, no plans for growth beyond the immediate neighborhood or district. The criminal operations were typically small-scale and unorganized, relying heavily on local networks of protection, extortion, and illegal trade, particularly in bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling. But this fragmented system, while effective on a smaller scale, was vulnerable. Power was often unpredictable and unstable, as new players could rise at any time, creating tension and rivalry. Many of the Mafia's most prominent figures during this era were mired in constant turf wars, not just with other gangs, but with law enforcement and politicians who were increasingly beginning to crack down on the illegal activities. They didn't see the Mafia as a business, they saw it as a patchwork of chaos and violence that could collapse at any moment. Luciano's rise occurred against this backdrop of uncertainty and conflict. He did not enter a world of stability and power, rather he entered a world of war and strife, where mobsters were constantly at odds over territory, resources, and influence. The old ways of running things were ineffective for the rising tide of urbanization and the demands of a rapidly growing economy. The criminal world needed to evolve, and that evolution would not come from the old bosses who clung to their positions with outdated methods of control. Luciano, seeing an opportunity where others saw only chaos, began to think about how the Mafia could function more efficiently, more like a corporation than a collection of feuding gangs. Luciano's first significant steps toward reshaping the underworld came through his alliance with powerful figures like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. These were not the traditional Mafia figures who followed the established code of silence and violence. They were shrewd, business-minded men who understood that the criminal world needed more than just muscle. It needed structure, discipline, and the ability to turn a profit. For Luciano, these relationships were critical. They marked a turning point not only in his personal rise but in the very transformation of organized crime. While many other mobsters were busy consolidating power through brute force, Luciano took a different route. He built connections that allowed him to operate with a much broader vision in mind. He understood that the future of the Mafia was not just about local control of neighborhoods or making money from illicit trades, it was about building an empire that could expand far beyond the confines of New York City. His alliance with men like Lansky and Siegel, who had their own networks and connections, allowed Luciano to lay the groundwork for the creation of a more efficient, far-reaching criminal operation. The transformation that Luciano envisioned was not just about making the Mafia more profitable, it was about making it more professional. He was able to see the potential of the Mafia as a global enterprise, and he started to treat it like one. Gone were the days when mobsters ran things out of personal vendettas or ego. Luciano saw that the future would require pragmatism, structure, and strategy. He understood the importance of having a system in place that could operate on multiple levels, local, regional, and national. But to achieve his vision, Luciano had to break down the existing power structures. He knew that in order to gain control of the Mafia, he had to challenge the old guard. At the time, the most powerful figure in New York's Mafia was Joe Masuria, a ruthless boss who ran his operation with absolute authority. Masuria ruled by fear, relying on his brutal enforcement tactics to maintain control over the territory. Luciano saw him as a threat to his own ambitions. Masuria's old-school approach was not conducive to the future Luciano envisioned. But challenging Masuria wouldn't be easy. The older boss had the loyalty of many of the Mafia's top soldiers, and any attempt to undermine him could lead to violent consequences. Still, Luciano knew that Masuria's reign was doomed. The world was changing, and the traditional methods of operating a criminal empire were no longer effective. Luciano's plan to overhaul the Mafia would not come without violence. It was inevitable that the old order would resist the new. But Luciano wasn't interested in blind loyalty or emotional vendettas. He was focused on results, and he knew that in order to secure his vision, he would have to play a far more subtle game than simply trying to overpower his rivals. What followed was a series of events that would become legendary in the annals of organized crime, the Castellamarese War. This war between Masuria and the rival boss Salvatore Maranzano marked a pivotal moment in the Mafia's history. For Luciano, it was not simply about taking sides in a gang war, it was about positioning himself to seize control. He didn't simply want to take over the turf of Masuria or Maranzano. He wanted to reshape the entire system. He saw that Masuria's methods of running the Mafia were outdated, and he began to maneuver behind the scenes, pulling strings and forging alliances that would eventually tilt the balance of power in his favor. The war itself was brutal. It was marked by a series of murders and ambushes that left dozens dead. But even in the midst of this violence, Luciano maintained a cool head, calculating his moves carefully. In the end, he made the pivotal decision to align with Maranzano, betraying Masuria and orchestrating his murder. It was a bold, decisive move that would establish Luciano as the most powerful figure in New York's Mafia, but it was also a testament to his ability to think beyond the immediate violence and chaos. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to maintain control of his operations while outmaneuvering his enemies with cold, strategic precision. The war, though bloody, was only the beginning of Luciano's reign. It was his most significant step in transforming the fragmented, chaotic world of the Mafia into a unified empire. It marked the end of the old, inefficient ways of operating and the beginning of a new era in organized crime, one in which Luciano's vision of unity, structure and profitability would take center stage. His success in consolidating power wasn't just a result of violence, it was the result of his calculated, forward-thinking strategies that would lay the foundation for the future of the Mafia. Salvatore "Lucky" Luciano's early life was a far cry from the world of power and intrigue that would later define him. Born in 1897 in the small town of Lercora in Sicily, Luciano's family immigrated to the United States when he was just 9 years old. They settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, an area notorious for its crowded tenements, poverty and cultural melting pot. For Luciano, this environment would become both a crucible and a springboard for his transformation into one of the most influential figures in American organized crime. It was in the gritty streets of New York City that the young Luciano began to shape his destiny, not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone with a fierce ambition to rise above the poverty and brutality that surrounded him. The Lower East Side in the early 20th century was a neighborhood rife with crime, corruption, and disillusionment. For many immigrant families, it was the land of opportunity and survival, though it was also a harsh world where power was taken rather than earned. The neighborhood was ruled by various gangs that fought for dominance, often clashing in bloody turf wars. It was an environment where street smarts, loyalty and ruthlessness were prized above all else. Here, Luciano was exposed to the underworld at an early age, drawn to its complex code of loyalty and its allure of power. It wasn't long before he realized that the same rules that govern the streets, loyalty, violence, fear, could also be the keys to upward mobility. From his teenage years, Luciano started building his reputation, though initially not in a way that foretold his future greatness. His first criminal endeavors were small-time, petty thefts, running numbers and minor hustles. These early ventures were typical of many young men in the neighborhood, struggling to make a name for themselves in a world where survival often meant aligning oneself with a gang. But while Luciano's peers were content with the rewards of small-time crime, he harbored ambitions that stretched far beyond street-level activities. He wasn't interested in scraping by, he was determined to build something larger, something that would last. It was clear from the start that his intelligence, coupled with his cold, calculating nature, set him apart from the other young criminals who populated the streets. By his late teens, Luciano was already beginning to associate with the more established figures in the criminal underworld. His relationships with men like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel would prove to be pivotal. While Luciano's ambition was apparent, what set him apart was his ability to surround himself with the right people. Lansky, in particular, would become one of his most important allies. Known for his sharp business mind and ability to turn a profit in any situation, Lansky shared Luciano's vision for a new type of organized crime, one that was not defined by blood feuds or short-term gains, but by long-term control and profitability. Together they would build a powerful alliance, one that would ultimately reshape the very foundation of the Mafia itself. Though Luciano's early criminal activities were rooted in the chaotic world of street gangs, his understanding of power and loyalty was already taking shape. He learned that the most effective criminals were not necessarily the ones who used the most violence, but those who could build networks, forge alliances, and stay out of the public eye. This was a lesson that would serve him well as he grew into one of the most powerful figures in the world of organized crime. Luciano was not merely content to rise through the ranks of the Mafia. He was determined to reinvent it, to build an empire that would stand the test of time. But Luciano's rise was not without its challenges. Like any ambitious young man seeking to make a name for himself in a world dominated by older, more established crime bosses, he faced constant threats. The Mafia at the time was a loose confederation of rival families, each vying for control of different territories and illegal enterprises. The old-school bosses such as Giuseppe Morello and Joe, the boss Masuria, ruled with iron fists, relying on fear and intimidation to maintain their grip on power. But Luciano, while respecting the traditions of the Mafia, recognized that the old ways were not sustainable in a world that was rapidly changing. The key to Luciano's rise lay not just in his ability to outsmart his rivals, but in his understanding of the larger shifts taking place in society. The early 20th century was a period of immense social and economic upheaval in the United States. The rise of industrialization, the mass migration of immigrants, and the booming Prohibition-era economy created opportunities that Luciano recognized but others overlooked. The illegal activities that had once been confined to small, neighborhood-level operations could now be organized into large-scale, highly profitable enterprises. What Luciano saw was not just an opportunity to climb the ranks of the Mafia, but an opportunity to transform it into a sophisticated, business-minded operation, one that could make massive profits while avoiding the attention of law enforcement. The turning point in Luciano's early life came in his 20s, when he began to make his mark in the world of bootlegging. Prohibition, which began in 1920, had created a booming black market for alcohol. Liquor, once sold openly in bars and restaurants, was now illegal, creating a perfect opportunity for organized crime to step in. Luciano quickly recognized the potential of this underground economy and saw it as a way to build his wealth and influence. His early ventures in bootlegging were highly profitable, and it was through this avenue that he began to establish himself as a formidable force within the criminal world. But Luciano's ambitions were not limited to bootlegging. He understood that the key to long-term power lay not in a single illegal activity, but in a diversified network of criminal enterprises. He began to expand his operations into gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering, turning the Mafia into a much more sophisticated organization. His ability to diversify and expand was a hallmark of his leadership, and it was this vision that would ultimately set him apart from other mobsters who were content to stick to one illegal trade. Luciano's ability to build and sustain relationships with powerful figures outside the Mafia also played a critical role in his rise. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were insular and focused solely on internal Mafia politics, Luciano saw the value in forging alliances with businessmen, politicians, and law enforcement officials. These connections helped him navigate the treacherous waters of both the underworld and the world of legitimate business. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was becoming a key player in the underworld, his influence stretching far beyond the streets of New York. He was no longer just a street gangster. He was becoming the architect of a new kind of organized crime. Yet even as his power grew, Luciano was still a young man, and his position within the Mafia was not yet secure. The criminal world, after all, was a dangerous one, where alliances could shift, and rivals were always looking for ways to seize power. Luciano's rise was not guaranteed, and he would face many obstacles along the way. But what set him apart from others in the Mafia was his ability to learn quickly, to adapt, and to think strategically. He was not just a product of his environment, he was a visionary who understood that in order to rule, he had to change the very system that others were content to follow. As the years went by, Luciano's influence continued to grow. But it wasn't just his criminal activities that made him a legend, it was his ability to manipulate the system, to outthink his enemies, and to build an empire that was as much about power as it was about control. He was a man who understood that, in the end, the most important thing was not who held the most territory or who had the most men, but who had the vision to see beyond the present and into the future. For Luciano, the game had only just begun. Lucky Luciano's rise to power was a meticulously calculated journey, one marked by strategy, alliances, and a deep understanding of both the criminal world and the business world. Unlike the gangsters who came before him, who operated out of personal vendettas and brute strength, Luciano saw organized crime as something that could be shaped, not just controlled. His ambition was to build a criminal empire that was not just about holding power in a few neighborhoods but about creating an infrastructure that could dominate cities, states, and even countries. To do this, Luciano would need to organize the Mafia in a way it had never been organized before. He had a vision for a centralized structure that would turn the disorganized chaos of competing families into a business machine, one that would be both profitable and resilient. In the early days of his rise, Luciano understood that the Mafia's greatest weakness was its disunity. The Mafia of the early 20th century was a patchwork of small territorial crime families that often clashed over turf, resources, and respect. In New York, the larger families such as the Morellos, the Genovese, and the Gambinos were each fighting for their piece of the city's criminal pie. This infighting made it difficult for the Mafia to grow beyond the local level and to operate efficiently. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to see that if the Mafia could unify, it could not only expand its operations but protect itself from both law enforcement and rival criminal groups. To achieve this, Luciano began by forging key alliances with powerful mobsters such as Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello. Each of these men brought a unique skill set to the table, and their partnership would prove to be crucial in Luciano's bid to overhaul the Mafia's structure. Lansky, in particular, was a crucial ally. His sharp business acumen and ability to handle large-scale operations made him an ideal partner for Luciano's vision. Siegel, known for his ruthlessness and charisma, helped bring muscle and loyalty to the table. Luciano knew that with these men at his side, he could not only consolidate power within New York City but also expand the Mafia's influence across the country. What made Luciano's vision truly revolutionary was his understanding of the mafia as a business. He saw the opportunity to turn illegal enterprises such as gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution into large-scale, organized operations. This was not just about crime for the sake of crime, it was about creating a profitable empire that could withstand external pressures, be they from the government or from rival factions within the mafia. Luciano's ability to turn a profit was unmatched. He understood that in order to build something lasting, the mafia needed to operate with a level of sophistication that rivaled legitimate businesses. Luciano's first major move toward this vision came when he orchestrated the infamous Castellammarese War, a conflict between rival mafia factions led by Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Masuria was an old-school boss who ran his operation with brute force and intimidation, while Maranzano represented a more organized approach, much closer to what Luciano envisioned. The war was bloody and chaotic, but it gave Luciano the opportunity to position himself strategically. While the majority of the mafia was focused on infighting, Luciano bided his time, building alliances that would give him the leverage he needed when the time came to strike. His ability to stay calm and patient during the war was a testament to his strategic genius. In 1931, the war ended with the assassination of Joe Masuria, orchestrated by Luciano himself. This was a pivotal moment not just in the Castellammarese War, but in the history of organized crime. Luciano had now removed one of the most powerful mob bosses in New York, leaving the field wide open for him to seize control. The assassination was not just a power grab, it was the culmination of Luciano's vision for a unified mafia. By eliminating Masuria, Luciano created a power vacuum that he would fill with his own vision for a more organized and centralized criminal empire. With Masuria gone, Luciano turned his attention to Maranzano, the other major player in the war. Maranzano had come out on top in the aftermath of Masuria's death, but he was not long for this world. Luciano, having consolidated his alliances and with the support of key figures like Lansky and Costello, moved quickly to eliminate Maranzano. In a brilliant stroke of tactical maneuvering, Luciano orchestrated Maranzano's assassination as well, effectively securing control of the mafia for himself. But Luciano's brilliance was not just in his ability to eliminate rivals, it was in how he organized the remnants of the mafia after the war. Instead of simply consolidating power for himself, Luciano restructured the mafia in a way that would ensure its long-term stability. He created the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the most powerful mafia families. This was a groundbreaking move. By creating the Commission, Luciano ensured that power within the mafia was distributed among several key families, rather than being concentrated in the hands of a single boss. This structure not only helped reduce infighting among the families but also created a more efficient way of resolving conflicts. The Commission would become the central governing body of the mafia, and Luciano would remain the undisputed mastermind behind it all. The creation of the Commission was a stroke of genius, as it allowed Luciano to create a centralized structure that could oversee the mafia's operations while still maintaining the appearance of decentralization. Each family would retain its own territory and operations, but the Commission would have the final say on major decisions, such as the allocation of territory, the distribution of profits, and the resolution of disputes. This system allowed Luciano to maintain control over the entire mafia without having to resort to direct, authoritarian rule. Instead, he acted as the behind-the-scenes mastermind, pulling the strings and ensuring that the mafia operated as a cohesive and efficient organization. While the creation of the Commission marked a major victory for Luciano, it was not the end of his efforts to expand the mafia's empire. He continued to build his influence across the United States, forging alliances with criminal figures in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and New Orleans. Luciano understood that in order for the mafia to thrive, it needed to operate on a national scale. He also recognized that the traditional methods of racketeering and bootlegging, while profitable, would not sustain the mafia in the long term. He needed to diversify the mafia's operations and turn it into a truly global enterprise. Luciano's international expansion came with the creation of the National Crime Syndicate, a network of organized crime figures from across the country who would work together to share resources and intelligence. This was another innovative move. By pooling their resources, the mafia families could operate more efficiently and expand their influence beyond the borders of the United States. Luciano's ability to think on a global scale would prove to be one of his most defining qualities. In addition to expanding the mafia's operations across the country, Luciano also turned his attention to new ventures, particularly in the world of labor unions. The mafia had long been involved in manipulating labor unions for profit, But Luciano saw the potential to control these unions on a much larger scale. By infiltrating key industries such as shipping, construction, and trucking, Luciano was able to create a massive network of corrupt labor unions that generated vast sums of money. His control over these unions gave him an unprecedented level of influence, not just within the criminal world but in the legitimate business world as well. But despite his success, Luciano's world was far from secure. He had created a criminal empire that stretched from coast to coast, but he had also made many enemies along the way. Rival mobsters, law enforcement, and politicians all had their sights set on him. The stakes were high and the risks were greater than ever. But Luciano was no ordinary mobster. He had built an empire that could withstand the pressures of both the criminal underworld and the government. His ability to maintain control and expand his influence, even in the face of growing opposition, would solidify his place as one of the most powerful and influential figures in the history of organized crime. In the underworld of organized crime, there exists an unspoken code that governs every action, every decision, and every relationship. It is a code that binds men together in a system built on loyalty, fear, and respect. This code is known as omerta, a set of principles that dictates the behavior of those within the mafia. It is a code that demands silence, loyalty, and above all, unwavering allegiance to the family. For Lucky Luciano, the concept of omerta was central to his reign. But while others followed this code because of its threats and penalties, Luciano understood its deeper significance. He knew that loyalty was not simply about obeying orders. Loyalty in the mafia was about survival, control, and trust. Omerta, in its essence, was about silence. It was the code of never speaking to outsiders about the business of the mafia. To break omerta was to risk everything: one's life, one's family, and one's position within the criminal world. The act of betraying the family was not just a moral failure, but a violation of the fundamental rules that kept the mafia intact. Without this code, the very fabric of the mafia would unravel. Silence was the glue that held the mafia together, and those who broke it paid the ultimate price. For Lucky Luciano, the code was more than just a set of rules. It was a tool, a psychological weapon he wielded with precision. Luciano didn't simply demand loyalty because it was expected. He understood that loyalty was a currency, one that could be traded, tested, and controlled. He was not a boss who ruled through fear alone, but through a deep understanding of human psychology. Luciano knew that loyalty had a price, and it was one that he could manipulate to ensure his own survival and success. While many mafia bosses demanded loyalty out of brute force, Luciano understood that true loyalty could not be bought, it had to be earned. He didn't rely solely on violence to maintain order within his ranks. Instead, he created an environment in which his underlings felt both fear and respect. His leadership style was not one of constant intimidation, but rather one that balanced control with a deeper understanding of the people who served him. He demanded loyalty, but he also gave loyalty in return. His ability to make his subordinates feel valued and essential to the operation was one of the key reasons for his success. Luciano also understood the psychological complexities of power. In the mafia, power was not just about controlling territory or wealth, it was about controlling people. Loyalty, when it worked, could be a form of psychological manipulation. By positioning himself as a figure who could both reward and punish, Luciano created a web of relationships where loyalty was both a shield and a weapon. His ability to make his men feel that their loyalty to him would bring them prosperity and protection was one of the most effective tools in his arsenal. In Luciano's world, loyalty went hand in hand with fear. The mafia was a violent world, where betrayal was punished harshly, and treachery often led to death. But Luciano didn't rely on violence for violence's sake. He understood that fear could be a tool to reinforce loyalty, but it had to be wielded with finesse. Too much fear could breed resentment, too little could lead to rebellion. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to strike that delicate balance. His men feared him, yes, but they also respected him. They knew that breaking the code would have catastrophic consequences, but they also knew that loyalty to Luciano meant security, wealth, and power. At the same time, Luciano's use of omerta helped him navigate the dangerous waters of law enforcement. The code provided a level of protection for those involved in the mafia, as it ensured that no one would betray the organization to the authorities. Law enforcement had long been trying to infiltrate the mafia and gather intelligence, but the code of silence made it nearly impossible to break the mafia's operations. Luciano, being a man who valued discretion, also understood that a quiet, well-run operation was far less likely to attract attention. The less noise the mafia made, the more effective it could be. But Luciano was not simply a passive participant in the Mafia's code of silence. He actively shaped it, using his understanding of the code to protect himself and his interests. In his mind, Omerta wasn't just about keeping the law off the Mafia's back, it was about keeping the Mafia running smoothly. It was a tool that allowed him to operate with a sense of calm and security, knowing that his men would protect him and each other from any outside threats. There were, of course, those who tested the boundaries of the code and they paid the price. One of the most notable examples of this was the fate of those who betrayed Luciano or his allies. The most infamous example of betrayal in Luciano's life came in the form of Joe Masuria, the powerful boss whom Luciano ultimately betrayed. Luciano's decision to turn on Masuria was not one made lightly, it was a calculated move that would forever change the course of the Mafia. But even as Luciano prepared to strike, he adhered to the principles of Omerta. He did not reveal his intentions to his enemies, he simply carried out his plan with cold precision. Masuria's death was a turning point in Luciano's rise to power, but it was also a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of the Mafia code. To betray a boss was to sign one's death warrant. But Luciano's ability to manipulate this principle made him an even more dangerous figure. Yet, despite the brutal nature of the Mafia's code, Luciano was not a mindless enforcer of silence. He knew that the code had limits, and in certain situations, the code could be bent to serve the greater purpose of the organization. While many Mafia bosses adhered to the strictest interpretation of Omerta, Luciano was pragmatic. He understood that sometimes, in order to achieve his vision, compromises had to be made. If silence and loyalty were the foundation of the Mafia, then so too was adaptability. Luciano's leadership style was one of calculated flexibility. He knew when to enforce the code and when to bend it to serve his interests. The code of Omerta also had psychological power within the family. Luciano created an environment where loyalty to him was not only expected, but necessary for survival. His ability to forge strong, personal connections with his men ensured that they remained loyal to him, even in the face of extreme adversity. Loyalty was not just a transaction, it was part of the culture he built. In his world, loyalty was the foundation on which his empire was built. The people around him understood that in order to thrive within the Mafia, they had to adhere to the rules, and the most important rule was silence. Silence about the organization's activities. Silence about its leaders. Silence, above all, about its weaknesses. Luciano's influence extended far beyond just his immediate circle. The Code of Omerta, which had once been a loose set of guidelines, was now an integral part of how the Mafia operated on a broader scale. Under Luciano's leadership, it became a core principle of the criminal underworld. The loyalty to the code was so powerful that it became a unifying force, holding the various factions of the Mafia together, even as they expanded into new territories and new criminal enterprises. The bond created by Omerta was one of trust. A trust that Luciano carefully cultivated and manipulated for his own purposes. Luciano knew that to maintain his power he would need to keep his men loyal not just to the code but to him. Loyalty to the family was crucial, but loyalty to him was paramount. He created an environment where he was not just a boss, but a leader in every sense of the word. His men respected him, feared him, and trusted him, all because of the psychological architecture he built around loyalty. It was this loyalty that allowed Luciano to consolidate his power, transform the Mafia into a thriving empire, and shape the course of organized crime for decades to come. Through it all, Omerta remained the unyielding force that bound the Mafia together, serving both as a shield against external forces and a tool for internal control. For Lucky Luciano, it was more than just a code, it was the key to his rise and his enduring legacy in the world of organized crime. Luciano's influence on the Mafia was not limited to its internal structure or the code of silence that kept it intact. He also recognized that organized crime, to be sustainable in the long term, had to evolve in terms of business operations. Where his predecessors had seen crime as something to be ruled through muscle, intimidation, and street-level politics, Luciano saw the potential to turn it into a sophisticated, profit-driven enterprise. He understood that organized crime wasn't just about illicit deals and bloody turf wars, it was about building profitable systems that could operate on a large scale. He had a vision that extended far beyond neighborhood protection rackets and speakeasies. What Luciano realized was that crime could be as profitable as any legitimate business, provided it was managed correctly. The heart of Luciano's business strategy lay in his ability to diversify. He didn't want to simply monopolize a few small-scale illegal activities, he wanted to control a wide array of profitable enterprises. One of his earliest and most lucrative ventures was bootlegging during Prohibition. When the 18th Amendment was passed in 1920, making the manufacture, sale and transportation of alcohol illegal, a massive underground economy sprang to life, and Luciano quickly recognized the opportunity for profit. Instead of running small, scattered bootlegging operations like many of his contemporaries, Luciano began to establish a centralized distribution network that could supply alcohol to cities and towns across the country. This centralized system made it far more efficient and profitable than anything that had existed before. The key to Luciano's success in bootlegging was not just his ability to move alcohol, it was his business-minded approach to the logistics of the operation. He streamlined the distribution process, ensuring that the product moved quickly and efficiently. He created a network of suppliers, distributors, and enforcers who could manage the various stages of the illegal alcohol trade. His operations were tight and well-coordinated, operating more like a corporation than a traditional criminal organization. In contrast to the chaotic, fragmented methods of other mobsters, Luciano's approach was clean, calculated, and ultimately far more successful. While bootlegging was his first major source of wealth, Luciano's understanding of crime as business didn't end there. He saw the potential for profit in several other areas: gambling, prostitution, labor unions, and even the trucking industry. By the 1930s, Luciano had established a monopoly on gambling across New York City. He didn't just oversee the backroom card games or numbers rackets that were common at the time, he turned them into large-scale, organized operations. The numbers game, for example, became a multi-million-dollar enterprise, with Luciano's men operating as a central syndicate for the entire city. It was more than just gambling, it was a complex network of people, systems, and profits. In addition to gambling, Luciano expanded his reach into other illicit enterprises, such as prostitution and narcotics. These were activities that had been part of the Mafia's operations for years, but Luciano saw how they could be organized on a much larger scale. He didn't simply take control of existing brothels or street-level narcotics deals. He structured them into profitable businesses, complete with set prices, schedules, and standards. Like any CEO, Luciano ensured that these operations were highly profitable and were run with a level of professionalism that was rare in the criminal world. His criminal operations weren't just about making money, they were about building empires. Luciano's vision extended to the world of labor unions, where he saw an incredible opportunity for profit and influence. The Mafia had long been involved in manipulating labor unions for their own gain, but Luciano was one of the first to truly see how powerful these organizations could be. By infiltrating unions that controlled the vital industries of shipping, construction, and transportation, Luciano was able to siphon off huge amounts of money. He created a massive network of corrupt labor unions, many of which were dominated by Mafia-controlled leadership. Through his control of these unions, Luciano could dictate the terms of contracts, ensure kickbacks, and stifle competition from non-Mafia affiliates. It wasn't just about extorting businesses, it was about controlling industries. One of Luciano's most important relationships in the world of labor unions was with the longshoremen's unions. The docks were crucial for the transport of goods, and by gaining influence over the longshoremen, Luciano could control the flow of goods into and out of the country. This gave him incredible leverage not just in terms of money but also in terms of power. He was able to use his influence over unions to manipulate labor strikes, push for favorable contracts, and create a virtual monopoly over the shipping industry in New York City. Luciano also saw the importance of expanding his operations beyond the borders of New York City. His vision was never just about dominating one city or one state. He understood that organized crime was most effective when it could operate on a national, even international, scale. He began to expand the Mafia's operations into other parts of the country, forging alliances with other crime families in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles. He created a network that stretched across the United States, allowing him to coordinate criminal operations across state lines. This national syndicate gave Luciano incredible power, as he now had the ability to influence not just local politics or law enforcement, but also the national economy. Internationally, Luciano saw opportunities for expansion as well. His connections in Sicily and Italy allowed him to forge alliances with the Italian Mafia, which opened up new opportunities for smuggling, drug trafficking, and other illicit activities. His international influence became particularly important in the world of narcotics, where he was able to coordinate large-scale drug smuggling operations from Europe to the United States. Luciano's operations were no longer confined to a single neighborhood or even a single country. They spanned continents, bringing in profits from all corners of the globe. Yet Luciano's business acumen wasn't just about amassing wealth, It was about creating a system that could operate smoothly, even when he wasn't present. Unlike many mob bosses who ruled through fear and intimidation, Luciano understood that in order for his empire to endure, it needed to be self-sustaining. He worked hard to ensure that each aspect of his criminal network ran like a well-oiled machine. Each family under the Mafia umbrella had its own designated roles and responsibilities, and Luciano made sure that they worked together in a coordinated fashion. This was a far cry from the chaotic, individualistic way that earlier crime bosses operated. Luciano's ability to create order out of chaos was one of the keys to his success. The profit-driven, business-like approach to organized crime also served as a form of protection. Luciano understood that the more money the Mafia made, the more power it would have to defend itself against law enforcement, rival criminal groups, and political interference. With money came influence, and with influence came the ability to ensure that his empire could withstand any threat. He used his wealth to bribe officials, corrupt law enforcement officers, and intimidate those who might challenge him. The Mafia became a force so powerful that it was nearly untouchable. But as much as Luciano built his empire on efficiency and profit, he never lost sight of the personal relationships that kept it all together. He may have been a shrewd businessman, but he understood that loyalty and trust were the foundations of his operations. While many mob bosses treated their associates as expendable assets, Luciano built strong bonds with those closest to him. His partnerships with figures like Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello were crucial to his success. These men weren't just his business partners, they were his allies, his confidants, and, in some cases, his friends. Luciano knew that in order for his empire to thrive, he had to ensure that those who worked for him were as committed to the success of the organization as he was. Luciano's ability to merge the criminal world with business-like principles transformed organized crime forever. His empire wasn't just about making money, it was about creating a system that could survive, expand, and adapt. His vision turned the Mafia into a multifaceted, national and international criminal enterprise. And in doing so, Luciano set the stage for a new era of organized crime, one that would change the way criminal organizations operated for decades to come. As the Mafia grew under Lucky Luciano's direction, so too did the complexity of its internal and external dynamics. The expansion of his empire brought with it not only greater wealth and power but also a host of new challenges. In the world of organized crime, alliances and rivalries are constantly in flux, and Luciano's ability to navigate this treacherous terrain would be put to the test as he built relationships with other powerful figures, both within and outside of the Mafia. With power came the inevitable risk of betrayal, and Luciano, though a master strategist, was not immune to the machinations of those around him. One of the central themes of Luciano's reign was his ability to create a network of loyal allies while simultaneously dealing with enemies both known and hidden. The very nature of organized crime meant that betrayal could come at any time, from any direction. While Luciano had successfully restructured the Mafia and eliminated his immediate rivals, the very system he built was also ripe for conflict. As Luciano's power grew, so did the number of individuals who sought to either challenge or align themselves with him. The Mafia, after all, is a business built on loyalty, and loyalty is something that can be easily shaken by ambition, jealousy, or simple self-preservation. One of the most notable rivalries during Luciano's reign was with the Genovese family. The tensions between Luciano and the Genovese family began long before Luciano's rise to power. The family, led by Giuseppe Morello and later, his successor Vito Genovese, had been a force in New York's Mafia for decades. However, Morello's death and Genovese's ambition created fractures in the Mafia's balance of power. Though Genovese was initially an ally of Luciano, the relationship would eventually sour as Genovese's own ambitions grew. Luciano's strength lay in his ability to recognize when a relationship had become toxic. He knew that Genovese's ambition could be a threat to the stability of the Mafia. When Genovese's actions started to challenge Luciano's vision, the Mafia boss acted quickly, using a combination of persuasion and force to neutralize the threat. This episode would mark a defining characteristic of Luciano's leadership: his willingness to remove anyone, even former allies, who threatened his empire. While the Genovese family represented an internal challenge, Luciano's rise also attracted the attention of law enforcement and rival criminal organizations outside of the Mafia. The rise of the FBI in the 1930s posed a significant threat to Luciano and the entire Mafia organization. The federal government, led by figures such as J. Edgar Hoover, began focusing intensely on organized crime, which would eventually lead to the crackdown that put many of the Mafia's top leaders in prison. Yet, Luciano was not an ordinary gangster. He understood that the fight against law enforcement was not one to be won with brute force alone. It was a battle of wits, strategy, and influence. Luciano's ability to outthink the law is best illustrated by his ability to survive the crackdown on organized crime in the early 1930s. During this period, many prominent mafia figures were arrested and imprisoned, including Luciano himself. But rather than allowing this setback to break his power, Luciano used his prison time to solidify his influence within the mafia. He maintained control over his empire, not through direct action, but through intermediaries, men he trusted implicitly to carry out his orders. Even behind bars, Luciano was still the central figure around which the mafia revolved. Perhaps the most significant external challenge to Luciano's reign came from a government that was increasingly hostile to organized crime. The rise of prohibition and the subsequent crackdown on bootlegging and smuggling represented a major shift in the power dynamics of the American underworld. Luciano's empire, which had been built on the profits of bootlegging and gambling, suddenly found itself in a vulnerable position. The federal government, under the leadership of figures like Franklin D. Roosevelt, passed laws designed to dismantle organized crime. These changes in the legal landscape put pressure on Luciano and his associates, forcing them to adapt or risk losing everything they had worked to build. But Luciano, ever the strategic thinker, understood that the key to survival was adaptability. The Prohibition era had brought the mafia to new heights, but with its end in sight, Luciano knew he needed to diversify. He focused on expanding into new areas of crime, such as narcotics trafficking, which was becoming an increasingly lucrative enterprise. By doing so, he ensured that the mafia was not dependent on any single source of income. Luciano's ability to pivot in the face of changing circumstances was one of the main reasons he was able to stay ahead of both his rivals and the law. Despite the many challenges Luciano faced, his ability to maintain control over the mafia was, in large part, due to his deep understanding of human nature. He knew how to build relationships, how to nurture loyalty, and, perhaps most importantly, how to manipulate fear and respect. Unlike many of his predecessors who relied solely on brute force to maintain control, Luciano understood that true power came from influence, especially the ability to influence the men who served him. This ability to control his men was evident in the relationships he cultivated with some of the most powerful figures in organized crime. Men like Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello were not just colleagues. They were trusted allies who understood that loyalty to Luciano was their ticket to wealth and power. But Luciano was also a realist. He knew that loyalty was never guaranteed, and that any weakness in his system could result in his downfall. His constant vigilance and ability to recognize and neutralize threats within his ranks were critical to his survival in such a cutthroat world. As Luciano continued to consolidate his power, his leadership style became more pronounced. He wasn't a hands-on boss. He was a mastermind behind the scenes, pulling the strings and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. This allowed him to operate more efficiently than many of his contemporaries, who were often bogged down by the day-to-day operations of their organizations. Luciano, in contrast, delegated responsibility to trusted lieutenants, allowing him to focus on the big picture. This hands-off approach gave him the freedom to plan his next moves, secure in the knowledge that his empire was functioning smoothly under the guidance of those he had placed in charge. But even the most powerful figures in history are not immune to the forces that threaten their reigns. As Luciano's empire grew, so did the risks of betrayal, both from his enemies and from those within his own ranks. The shifting tides of power, the ever-present threat of law enforcement, and the rivalries that continued to fester within the mafia were constant reminders of the precarious nature of Luciano's position. Despite his brilliance as a strategist and his ability to outmaneuver rivals, the day would eventually come when his empire would be tested in ways he could not predict. In many ways, Luciano's story is one of survival. He was a man who understood the forces that shaped the criminal world and used those forces to his advantage. He was not just a product of his environment, he was a man who molded that environment to fit his vision. His ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast his enemies became the foundation of his reign. But as his empire grew, so did the enemies who sought to bring him down, both from within and from outside the mafia. It was this constant balancing act, between loyalty and betrayal, power and vulnerability, that would ultimately define Luciano's journey and set the stage for his eventual downfall. The world that Lucky Luciano had meticulously built began to show signs of strain as both internal and external pressures mounted. His reign, though brilliantly orchestrated, was not impervious to the forces of law enforcement, growing discontent within the mafia, and the shifting tides of American politics. Despite his unparalleled skill in consolidating power and maintaining control, Luciano faced a new battle: survival. The legal landscape was becoming increasingly hostile toward organized crime, and the very government he had long outwitted began to close in on him. It wasn't just the local police or rival crime families that posed a threat anymore, it was the full might of the U.S. government with its growing resources and determination to dismantle the Mafia. The turning point came in the early 1930s when a series of high-profile investigations and prosecutions began targeting organized crime figures like never before. The government, under the leadership of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Attorney General Homer Cummings, began to make a concerted effort to root out corruption and criminal enterprises that had become so deeply embedded in American society. The criminal syndicates, once seen as untouchable, were suddenly under intense scrutiny, and Luciano was squarely in the crosshairs of federal agents. Luciano, however, was no stranger to adversity. He had faced rivalries, betrayals, and countless challenges in the past, and he had always managed to navigate them with skill and foresight. But this time the stakes were higher. The government had learned from past mistakes. It wasn't just trying to arrest mobsters, it was attempting to dismantle the entire system that Luciano had worked so hard to build. The law had become a formidable adversary, and the pressures of facing such an enemy began to weigh heavily on Luciano. In 1936, after years of mounting pressure from law enforcement, Luciano's downfall began to take shape. The federal government, recognizing the need for a decisive strike, intensified its efforts to capture the most powerful figures in the Mafia. The centerpiece of this initiative was the work of the U.S. Treasury Department's Criminal Division, led by the tenacious prosecutor Thomas Dewey. Dewey had made a name for himself by taking on organized crime, and he was determined to bring Luciano to justice. The case against Luciano was not just based on his involvement in criminal enterprises like gambling, bootlegging, and narcotics trafficking. It was also tied to his ties with corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials, which made his empire all the more formidable and difficult to dismantle. In 1936, the government finally succeeded in bringing Luciano to trial. The trial was a massive spectacle, drawing public attention from across the country. The media frenzy surrounding the case was unlike anything that had come before. For Luciano, this was the moment of reckoning. The very empire he had built, an empire based on secrecy, loyalty, and fear, was now on full display for the world to see. The walls that had once shielded him from the prying eyes of the law were quickly crumbling. His powerful allies in government, law enforcement, and business could no longer protect him from the weight of the evidence that had been gathered against him. The trial was a meticulous affair, and the government was determined to make an example out of Luciano. Dewey and his team focused on bringing down the man who had become synonymous with organized crime. The charges were sweeping and included everything from running illegal gambling syndicates to orchestrating the trafficking of narcotics. What made the case even more damning was the revelation that Luciano had been operating with a level of coordination and efficiency that made him seem more like a corporate CO than a traditional gangster. The public, who had long been fascinated by the mystique of the Mafia, was now getting a glimpse into the inner workings of Luciano's criminal empire. What they saw was a network of power, influence, and ruthlessness that seemed to reach every corner of the nation. Luciano's legal defense was formidable, but the tide was against him. Despite his best efforts to deflect, the evidence stacked up. His long history of criminal activities, combined with the testimony of several key witnesses, made it increasingly clear that Luciano was at the center of a vast criminal enterprise. The government had been patient in building its case, and now it was paying off. Luciano's empire, once untouchable, was unraveling before his eyes. The trial culminated in a guilty verdict, and in 1936, Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison for his role in running a criminal enterprise. It was a devastating blow to the man who had once controlled vast sections of New York's criminal underworld. Luciano, however, did not give up without a fight. He appealed the conviction, arguing that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that the prosecution had used questionable tactics to secure the verdict. But the appeal was rejected, and Luciano's fate was sealed. He was sent to Sing Sing prison, one of the most notorious correctional facilities in the United States. The man who had once commanded an empire was now behind bars, his future uncertain. But even within the walls of Sing Sing, Luciano's grip on power was not completely severed. Unlike many of his fellow inmates, Luciano continued to operate his criminal empire from prison. He was a man of extraordinary adaptability, and he understood that his influence did not end with his incarceration. Though he was physically confined, Luciano remained a central figure in the Mafia. He kept in contact with his loyal allies, giving orders and managing the organization from his cell. Through intermediaries, he maintained control over key operations, ensuring that his empire continued to thrive even behind bars. This ability to manage the Mafia remotely became one of Luciano's most remarkable traits. He was still very much in charge even if he couldn't walk the streets of New York anymore. Luciano's ability to control his empire from within prison was aided by his alliance with key figures who had become entrenched in the criminal underworld. Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello were some of the key players who helped keep Luciano's interests alive while he served his sentence. Lansky, in particular, played a crucial role in maintaining the financial stability of Luciano's operations, ensuring that they continued to make money despite the setback of his imprisonment. Lansky, who was deeply loyal to Luciano, managed the day-to-day activities of the Mafia while Luciano handled strategic decisions from afar. This arrangement allowed Luciano to maintain a semblance of control over the Mafia and to continue expanding his influence, despite the physical constraints of prison life. As Luciano sat in prison, the world around him continued to change. The government's crackdown on organized crime was intensifying, and the Mafia was facing new challenges. But Luciano, ever the pragmatist, understood that survival in the world of organized crime was not just about brute force, it was about adapting to the times. He began to focus on ways to maintain his influence and power, even as the world around him shifted. One of the ways Luciano maintained his power was by continuing to develop alliances with figures outside the Mafia. In particular, he cultivated relationships with political figures and law enforcement officers who could help him navigate the increasingly hostile environment. Luciano's political connections were invaluable, as they allowed him to secure preferential treatment in prison and influence decisions that could impact his future. These relationships would eventually help Luciano secure his release from prison. In 1946, after serving just over a decade in prison, Luciano was granted a commutation. His release was a result of a combination of factors, including the growing pressure from political and business leaders who saw the benefit of freeing him. Luciano had, after all, become a symbol of the Mafia, and his continued imprisonment was seen as a potential hindrance to the Mafia's ability to operate smoothly in the post-war world. But the fact that Luciano was granted his release, despite the seriousness of his crimes, was also a testament to his enduring influence. Even behind bars, Luciano had remained a powerful figure, and his ability to navigate the system was a remarkable feat in itself. Luciano's release marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Though he was no longer in control of the Mafia in the same way he once had been, his influence remained strong. He was deported to Italy, where he spent the final years of his life. However, his return to Italy was not without complications. Though he had been freed from prison, Luciano's criminal activities had not come to an end. He continued to maintain ties with the Mafia and remained a respected figure in organized crime circles. Despite the fact that he was now living in exile, Luciano's legacy continued to shape the world of organized crime for many years to come. His story was one of survival, adaptation, and unyielding power in a world where betrayal and shifting alliances were part of the game. As the years unfolded in the turbulent world of organized crime, the unstoppable rise of Lucky Luciano had come to a dramatic halt. The legacy he had crafted, the intricate, vast network of power, control and wealth, was suddenly threatened by an unexpected and unrelenting force, the justice system. The arrest, trial and eventual conviction of Luciano were the culmination of years of mounting pressure from both law enforcement and his enemies within the Mafia. The fact that the man who had once orchestrated the very fabric of organized crime from behind closed doors was now sitting in a courtroom, facing the full weight of the legal system, was a testament to both the relentless pursuit of justice and the vulnerability that even the most powerful men face when their empire is on the line. Luciano's trial was unlike any other in the history of the Mafia. It wasn't just the U.S. government that sought to put him behind bars. It was the culmination of a societal reckoning with organized crime that had, for too long, lurked in the shadows of American life. The public's fascination with mobsters like Luciano had always been intense, but the trial exposed not only his criminal activities but also the complexities of the man himself. As the media painted Luciano as a ruthless, calculating figure, the trial also revealed a story of personal survival and ambition. His rise had been nothing short of spectacular, but now, in the cold, sterile atmosphere of the courtroom, the man who had been a symbol of unassailable power had to face the consequences of his actions. The trial lasted for months, and the courtroom became a stage for the nation to watch, gripped by the spectacle of a mob boss being brought to justice. Luciano's defense team worked tirelessly to dismantle the charges, casting doubt on the evidence and testimony presented against him. Despite the elaborate legal strategies, however, the evidence stacked against Luciano was overwhelming. What made the trial even more intense was the involvement of Thomas Dewey, the assistant district attorney who had made it his mission to bring Luciano down. Dewey's relentless pursuit of the Mafia boss was a personal one, and the prosecutor became a formidable opponent for Luciano. The media's coverage of the trial was relentless, and the public eagerly awaited the outcome. The conviction was a devastating blow to Luciano. After years of consolidating power and building a criminal empire that stretched from New York to the furthest corners of the world, he was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. It wasn't just the years behind bars that were painful, it was the crushing reality that his empire was crumbling. The man who had once ruled over vast criminal operations was now at the mercy of a legal system that had made it its mission to dismantle his world. For someone like Luciano, who had spent his life operating in the shadows, the sudden exposure to the bright lights of justice was as disorienting as it was humbling. Yet, despite the conviction, Luciano remained a figure of immense power. His reputation as a mastermind of organized crime was undiminished by the verdict. In fact, the trial itself only added to the mystique that surrounded him. The fact that such a prominent figure in the world of organized crime could face the legal system and yet still remain a powerful force in the underworld spoke to his enduring influence. Even as he was led away in handcuffs, his name continued to command respect and fear in equal measure. Luciano's time in prison, however, was not one of passive defeat. While many expected him to be a mere shadow of his former self, locked away in a cell and cut off from the world he had once ruled, Luciano proved to be anything but a passive figure. He did not simply fade into obscurity. Instead, he adapted to his new reality in a way that only someone of his intelligence and resourcefulness could. Even behind the bars of Sing Sing, Luciano found ways to maintain control over his empire. He continued to issue orders, maintain connections, and ensure that the Mafia's operations continued without disruption. This ability to maintain his grip on power, even from within prison walls, was a testament to Luciano's exceptional leadership skills. Luciano's influence from prison was not an act of pure command but a careful strategy. He recognized that the Mafia needed to function as a cohesive, well-oiled machine. To accomplish this, he relied on trusted lieutenants who could execute his orders on the outside. Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, men who had been integral to Luciano's rise, became the key figures who ensured the continuity of his operations. They became his eyes and ears, carrying out his plans and making decisions in his stead. The trust that Luciano placed in these men was absolute, and their loyalty to him ensured that his criminal empire remained intact. Despite Luciano's extraordinary ability to remain involved in the Mafia's operations from behind bars, the ever-present pressure from law enforcement continued to mount. The authorities were relentless in their pursuit of him, and the FBI's efforts to build a case against him did not stop with his conviction. Luciano's every move was being monitored, and there was a constant sense of unease that even he, with all his influence, might eventually face a total dismantling of his power. The government's efforts to break the Mafia were not just about bringing down one man, they were part of a larger, concerted effort to reshape the criminal underworld. Luciano's time in prison was punctuated by constant attempts to undermine his influence. Various factions within the Mafia saw this as an opportunity to gain ground, and new rivalries began to form. The fact that Luciano remained in power while incarcerated led to resentment among some of his peers, who felt that they had been sidelined. This resentment would eventually play a role in Luciano's downfall, but it also underscored just how deeply his presence was felt in the world of organized crime. Luciano was more than just a figurehead. He was the very cornerstone of the Mafia's success, and without him the system seemed to lack direction. The constant threat of a total collapse loomed, but Luciano's resilience never wavered. Throughout his incarceration, he maintained a degree of control over the Mafia's operations. However, the shifting political and legal landscape would soon force him to make some difficult decisions. One of the most significant developments was his eventual release from prison in 1946. The decision to grant him parole was not made lightly, but it reflected the reality that Luciano's continued imprisonment may not be in the best interest of the country, especially in the post-World War II world. Luciano's release was a political maneuver as much as it was a personal one. In the years following his conviction, the government had come to view Luciano as a symbol of organized crime's entrenched hold on American society. However, they also recognized that his influence could be useful, especially as the country sought to rebuild and stabilize after the war. Luciano's ability to broker deals and maintain order, both within the Mafia and in his relationships with political figures, was seen as an asset. There were also rumors that the government had reached a tacit understanding with Luciano, that if he were freed he would refrain from certain activities at least publicly. Luciano's release was celebrated within the criminal world, as it signified his return to prominence. However, his time outside of prison was not without its complications. He was deported to Italy, a country he had left behind many years earlier, and this presented a new set of challenges. Luciano, who had spent most of his life in New York, was now in exile in a foreign land. Though his ties to the Mafia remained strong, he was no longer in a position to exert the same level of control over the operations he had once dominated. His deportation to Italy marked a new phase in his life, one that was marked by his efforts to rebuild his influence within the international criminal scene. Luciano's relationship with Italy's own Mafia families remained strong, and he continued to maintain connections with former allies in the United States. However, the reality of living in exile was far different from the power he had enjoyed in his prime. He was no longer the central figure in the world of organized crime, and his health began to deteriorate as the years passed. Luciano's final years were spent in relative obscurity. He lived in a modest apartment in Naples, far from the grandeur and wealth he had once commanded. Though he was still respected by those in the criminal world, his influence had waned. In January of 1962, Luciano died from a heart attack. His death, while not unexpected, marked the end of an era. The man who had reshaped the Mafia, who had built an empire from the ground up, was gone. But his legacy remained, a shadow that would continue to loom over the world of organized crime for decades to come. His story was one of rise, fall, and survival, a testament to the complexities of power and the lengths one man was willing to go to hold on to it, even when the world seemed to be closing in around him. Luciano's conviction marked the beginning of a profound shift not only in his personal fate but in the broader landscape of organized crime. The courtroom drama, the media frenzy, and the subsequent verdict were the culmination of a long period of growing tension between the Mafia's unchecked rise to power and the U.S. government's increasing resolve to take action. But the trial was not merely about the end of Luciano's dominance, it was the beginning of a new phase in both his life and the future of organized crime. When Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years, it seemed like the end of an era. The man who had built the modern Mafia, who had turned crime into a well-oiled business-like operation, was now behind bars, unable to direct the syndicate he had shaped. Yet even as his life seemed to be unraveling, it became clear that Luciano was no ordinary mob boss. His legacy wasn't confined to the power he had wielded while free, it extended to the way he had reshaped organized crime itself, building a system that even without him would continue to function. His trial didn't just bring down the man, it brought down an era of mobsters who were still operating with outdated methods. While other figures like Al Capone had been undone by their reliance on brute force and overt violence, Luciano had built something more durable, something that could continue to operate even when its leader was incapacitated. The modern Mafia was no longer just a loose collection of criminals. It was a sophisticated, multi-tiered organization that Luciano had designed to survive long-term. The skills that made him a criminal mastermind, his business acumen, his ability to forge alliances, his knack for understanding the value of loyalty, were the very things that ensured the Mafia could withstand his absence. While incarcerated, Luciano remained a towering figure. The Mafia continued to function under the leadership of trusted men like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others. These lieutenants were more than just soldiers, they were stewards of the empire Luciano had built. Their loyalty to him ensured that his influence continued to resonate throughout the underworld, even from the confines of prison. But more than that, Luciano's incarceration forced the Mafia to evolve in new ways. With him no longer at the helm, the syndicate would have to find new methods to keep its operations running smoothly. Luciano's sentence and subsequent prison time didn't diminish his power as much as one might expect. Instead of crumbling, the Mafia adapted. Even as law enforcement tightened the noose around organized crime, Luciano's men found ways to keep the organization afloat. They continued to operate gambling rings, labor rackets, and bootlegging businesses. The structure Luciano had laid out remained intact, with various families and figures coordinating their activities to maintain the flow of money and power. What made this possible was Luciano's foresight. Unlike the Mafia leaders of the past, who relied on violent intimidation and chaos to run their operations, Luciano built a more sophisticated model. His model of organization resembled that of a corporation more than a criminal syndicate. He established a clear hierarchy and distributed responsibilities among trusted individuals, ensuring that no one person was irreplaceable. He also built a system that was self-sustaining. His empire could operate without him at the top. And so, even in his absence, Luciano's criminal network continued to thrive. In prison, Luciano's situation remained far from passive. He may have been physically confined, but his mind remained sharp and active. He continued to strategize and guide his empire through trusted intermediaries. His ability to control his organization from behind bars only strengthened his mystique. To the outside world, he was a figure of immense power and influence. Even those who had once been his rivals, like members of the Genovese and Gambino families, continued to respect him and defer to his authority. His mythic status in the underworld persisted, and many saw him as the undisputed kingpin, even in his most vulnerable state. The fact that Luciano managed to maintain such control from within prison showed just how deeply his philosophy of organized crime had penetrated the system. He had not only established a criminal empire that was built to endure but also created a legacy of leadership and strategic thinking that influenced generations of mafia figures who would come after him.